billionaire father sees black waitress let his disabled son lead a dance step and then changes her life forever. The silence that fell over Kingsley's Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant was so thick it seemed to have weight. Conversation ceased, cutlery froze in midair, and dozens of eyes fixed on the small space between the tables. 10-year-old Lucas Montgomery was visibly shaking, his legs trapped in metal braces wavering as he reached out to Diana Johnson, the restaurant's only black waitress. The live piano had just begun a soft melody, and the boy's impulse to ask someone to dance came without warning. "Sir, control your son." Manager Thornton's sharp voice cut through the silence. "That's inappropriate. This is not a dance hall, and our employees are not here to entertain children." Richard Montgomery, owner of Montgomery Investments and one of the richest men in the country, swallowed hard. It was the first time he had taken Lucas out to dinner in public since the accident that partially paralyzed his legs 2 years earlier, a mistake he would not repeat. "Lucas, sit down." The order came low but firm. Diana remained motionless, her gaze shifting between the manager, the billionaire, and the boy whose hand was still hanging in the air. In her 5 years working there, she had learned to become invisible, especially to customers like Montgomery. "Mr. Thornton, I'm leaving. My shift is over." Her voice sounded calm as she removed her apron and placed it on the tray. Then, to everyone's amazement, she smiled at Lucas and took his hand. "I can't dance in an apron." Richard stood up abruptly. "What do you think you're doing?" Diana held his gaze. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." Before anyone could interfere, Lucas took a hesitant step forward. His foot dragged painfully across the floor, and the metal of his braces screeched. But Diana didn't try to guide or hurry him. She simply adjusted her pace to his. "She's getting fired tomorrow," whispered a woman at the next table. Richard watched, paralyzed as a sudden memory struck him. Elizabeth, his late wife, dancing with Lucas in the living room. "It's not about perfection," she had said. "It's about connection." As Diana followed Lucas's clumsy steps, something in the boy's eyes changed. Fear gave way to intense concentration, and shame gave way to shy pride. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't being guided, helped, or corrected, he was leading. "Mr. Montgomery," the manager's voice interrupted his thoughts. "I can assure you this will never happen again. She will be properly disciplined." Richard didn't respond. The entire restaurant seemed to wait for his reaction. After all, a man of his power could end anyone's career with a single word. Employees stopped what they were doing, and other customers watched with morbid curiosity. Lucas's smile, however, was the only sound that echoed in his mind. Diana led the boy back to the table after 3 dance steps. "Thank you for asking me out," she said formally, as if speaking to an adult. "It was an honor." When she turned to leave, Richard stopped her. "Wait," his voice sounded different, almost unrecognizable to himself. "What's your full name?" "Diana Johnson, sir." Richard nodded slowly, repeating her name as if memorizing it. Then he took a card from inside his jacket and held it out to her. "My office. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. The entire restaurant held its breath. Diana accepted the card without showing any emotion, though her hand trembled slightly. "Dad," Lucas called as she walked away, "why did you do that?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Richard watched his son, and for a brief moment, saw not just the child Elizabeth had left in his care, but a complete human being whose wants and needs he had systematically ignored for 2 years. As dinner proceeded in awkward silence, no one noticed Diana's glance before she left, not out of fear or resignation, but out of a calm determination that contrasted with the storm brewing in Richard Montgomery's eyes. If this story about dignity and transformation is already touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow how a simple gesture of respect can spark a silent revolution capable of transforming lives forever. The lobby of Montgomery Tower sparkled with its glass and marble walls, reflecting the morning sunlight. Diana Johnson immediately felt out of place in her best outfit, a navy blue skirt and white blouse bought on sale. The people passing by her wore clothes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "Diana Johnson to see Mr. Montgomery," she said to the receptionist, who examined her with a clinical gaze before making the call. "18th floor, Miss Winters will see you." In the elevator, Diana took a deep breath, clutching her worn purse to her chest. It wasn't fear she felt. It was a quiet determination that came from having faced worse, much worse. Miss Winters, a woman in her 40s with a sharp gaze and impeccable posture, met her and said, "Mr. Montgomery is in a conference call. Please follow me." As they walked through the mirrored hallways, Diana felt the curious stares of employees. A black woman being escorted through the executive offices was a rare enough occurrence to spark speculation. "He had you fired, didn't he?" Winters asked suddenly when they were alone in a waiting room. "It happens. Powerful clients call and people like you lose their jobs." "People like me?" Diana repeated. "You know what I mean," Winters said, adjusting her glasses. "Employees who don't know their place." Diana smiled, not amused. "And where exactly would that be?" Before Winters could reply, her phone rang. "He'll see you now." Richard Montgomery's office took up half the floor, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan looked like a distant playground. The man stood gazing out at the city as if it were his personal property. "Mr. Montgomery," Diana greeted him formally. Richard turned, his face a mask of studied control. "Miss Johnson, thank you for coming." He pointed to a chair. "Please." The silence that followed was calculated, a tactic Diana recognized immediately, the kind meant to make nervous people talk too much and incriminate themselves. "Do you have a background?" Richard finally asked. "Excuse me?" "Education, college." Diana kept her gaze steady. Bachelor's degree in child development from New. Incomplete master's degree in special education. Something flickered across Richard's face, surprise perhaps. "And you work as a waitress?" "I work 3 jobs actually. The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and as a tutor when I can get students." Richard moved to her table, picking up a folder. "I did some research on you, Miss Johnson. I wanted to understand who the person was who," he hesitated, "danced with my son." He opened the folder, revealing printed photos of a community center. "Freedom Steps, you founded that 6 years ago." Diana sat up straighter. "I co-founded it with my sister Zoe, a dance program for children with physical disabilities." Richard leafed through some documents, "which is now about to close due to lack of funding." Diana wasn't surprised. Of course he would find all that out in less than 24 hours. "I didn't come here to ask you for money, Mr. Montgomery." "Then why did you come?" "Because you invited me." Richard laughed softly, a joyless sound. "Fair enough." He stood again, restless. "I want you to work for me." Diana blinked, genuinely taken aback. "As a waitress in your house?" Richard's face hardened. "As a therapeutic companion for Lucas." Even his son's name seemed difficult for him to say. Diana noticed how his eyes briefly drifted to a photo on the table. A smiling woman holding a baby. "I have the best specialists in the country," Richard continued. "Physical therapists, neurologists, psychologists. But what you did yesterday," he paused as if the words betrayed him. "It was just a dance, Mr. Montgomery." It was the first time I've seen him smile since the accident. The admission was painful. "I don't want a dancer for my son. I want someone who can do what you did. Follow, not lead." Diana studied the man in front of her. Beneath the facade of power and control, she saw what others might not, a desperate, lost father. "I can pay you 5 times what you're making now." Diana stood up. "No." Richard looked shocked, like someone unaccustomed to hearing that word. Diana calmly explained that she did not work for people who saw only her color or social class before her competence. And she certainly did not work for those who tried to buy emotional solutions. Causing Richard's face to flush as she corrected him, she was refusing not out of pride, but out of dignity. And because his son deserved better than someone paid to pretend to care. She walked to the door, paused, and told him Lucas didn't need more experts, but space to lead his own life. And though Richard insisted she didn't know his son, she gently replied that she knew people like him, whose physical limitations were smaller than the invisible cages built around them. Then placed a Freedom Steps card on his table, offering Lucas a free first class. As she left, Winters stared in disbelief, whispering if Diana was crazy to reject Richard Montgomery. But Diana smiled and said she'd rather be crazy than property. The following Wednesday at the community center, Zoe rushed to Diana, announcing a Bentley outside. And through the window, Diana saw Lucas in the back seat, while Richard remained gripping the wheel, as though battling himself. Yet, contrary to Zoe's doubts about men like him visiting places like theirs, both father and son emerged from the car, Richard looking awkward in his attempt at casual clothing, prompting Diana's quiet remark that she knew he'd come. Zoe asked what she had done, unaware of the hidden notebook under Diana's bed, filled with years of notes, observations, and plans inspired by children like Lucas and men like Richard, plans set in motion the moment she accepted the boy's invitation to dance. Freedom Steps, operating inside an old warehouse decorated with handmade motivational posters, welcomed Richard and Lucas into a room where children with diverse mobility devices moved freely to soft music. When Richard commented that the scene looked chaotic, Diana explained there was structure, just not one he recognized, before inviting Lucas, who looked to his father for permission until Richard, tense but trying, told him to go ahead. As Zoe offered Richard a chair, noting the first day was hardest for parents, he insisted he had hired the best rehabilitation specialists, to which she gently asked how well that had been working. Moments later, Dr. Elaine Mercer arrived, an elegant older woman with a cane and a commanding presence, introduced by Zoe as a retired Harvard neuroscientist studying brain plasticity, who immediately reminded Richard that he had rejected her proposal 3 times. Confused, he said he thought this was only a community dance class. But Diana, returning as Lucas experimented with movements, explained that Freedom Steps was a pilot motor rehabilitation program based on movement autonomy, blending adaptive dance with neuroscience. When Richard asked why she worked as a waitress if she led such a program, she replied it lacked funding and that people like him had rejected them. Dr. Mercer clarified that Diana, co-author of those proposals, had an incomplete master's due to caring for her sister, but possessed groundbreaking theoretical work. Richard finally understood Diana had known exactly who he was at the restaurant. And she confirmed it. She recognized him the moment he walked in. And when Lucas stood to dance, she saw a chance to demonstrate rather than explain. Insisting the moment wasn't staged, Lucas chose to rise. And she chose to follow. A group of reporters entered the studio, making Richard immediately tense as he demanded to know what was happening. But Diana replied that it was part 2 of the plan. While Zoe handed him a freshly published article titled "Revolutionary Motor Rehabilitation Methodology Shows Promising Results," Dr. Mercer explained they had published their first results and invited the press, prompting Richard's icy accusation that they had used his son for a PR stunt. So Diana led him into a side room lined with photos of dozens of children and handwritten progress notes, stopping before an empty frame that she explained represented their future, a fully funded rehabilitation center that could help 500 children a year instead of 50. When Richard muttered that she had orchestrated everything, the dance, the meeting, bringing him on press day, Diana admitted she had seen an opportunity after he had canceled their meeting months ago without reading the proposal. But before he could respond, Zoe rushed in saying it was Lucas. and they hurried back to find the boy in the center of the room, attempting to balance with one brace removed. The music off, everyone watching. Richard moved to intervene, but Diana whispered for him to wait as Lucas inhaled, focused, and took a full shaky step on his own, causing the children to cheer and cameras to flash while Richard's usually unreadable face glistened with unshed tears. Diana softly explained that Freedom Steps wasn't about perfect steps, but first steps taken independently. And as Richard watched his son not as a problem, but as a person discovering his own strength, he insisted this could have happened without manipulation. To which Diana replied that it could have if he had ever answered their calls or bothered to read their proposals. Reporters noticed Richard, murmurs spreading while Lucas, oblivious to the tension, continued practicing with determined concentration, leaving Richard Montgomery cornered between retreating in anger, confirming his cold reputation, or embracing the moment his son had created, standing in unfamiliar territory where neither his money nor influence could determine the next step. The man who controlled every aspect of his life now faced a choice that no amount of wealth could buy. His gaze shifted between his smiling son and the reporters waiting for his reaction. Humility was not a virtue in his vocabulary, but as he saw the transformation on Lucas's face, something inside him began to break. The orchestra of power and privilege he was accustomed to now played a different tune, and he had to decide whether he would continue conducting or learn to follow. Richard Montgomery faced the reporters waiting for his reaction. His son had just taken a step on his own in front of the cameras, and Diana Johnson had skillfully led him to this impossible moment. A reporter approached, asking if he could comment on his presence at Freedom Steps and whether it was true his foundation had rejected funding the program 3 times. Richard glanced at Lucas, who was still practicing his new step, oblivious to the political tension. And then, to everyone's surprise, especially Diana's, he smiled. He addressed the reporter and admitted loudly enough for all to hear that the hardest thing for someone in his position was admitting when they were wrong, and a stunned silence filled the room. He announced that the Montgomery Foundation would fully fund Freedom Steps for the next 5 years and build a permanent rehabilitation center based on the methodology developed by Dr. Mercer and Ms. Johnson, adding one condition, that Ms. Johnson retain complete autonomy over the program with no corporate interference. 3 months later, bulldozers were clearing ground for the new Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center. Not the most luxurious project the foundation had ever funded, but the most innovative, with every space designed with input from the children and their families. Diana supervised construction frequently, never alone. Lucas showed up regularly, often bringing other children, and even Richard Montgomery appeared often, silently observing progress. One afternoon as they reviewed plans, Diana remarked she never thought he would attend board meetings, and he replied he never thought he'd be studying neuroplasticity at 50, rubbing his eyes over a scientific article covered in post-it notes. Diana asked whether this was public penance, or if he really cared. Richard revealed Lucas had asked to remove his second brace last week, and Diana smiled, reminding him he had fired the previous physical therapist because she had told him it would be impossible for 2 years. Diana pointed to a photo of Lucas, balancing on one crutch, and noted he was progressing faster than any prediction. Richard suddenly asked why she had never accepted his apology, and Diana replied that he had never apologized. He had redirected resources, changed policies, and funded the program, but that was compensation, not an apology. Richard nodded, acknowledging the point. At the opening ceremony 6 months later, the contrast with the restaurant night was striking. The huge adaptive space was filled with children using various mobility devices, all moving freely, and in the center, Lucas, wearing only a lightweight brace on his left leg, led a small routine with 3 other children, his limited movements now filled with confidence no doctor had predicted. Richard watched from a distance, not interfering, and Diana approached, noting Lucas no longer needed him to hold him. Richard agreed, but said he still needed him to be around a crucial difference. Richard then thanked her, and when she asked for what exactly, he said for teaching him to follow. A reporter approached and asked how it felt to see his son's progress. Richard looked at Lucas helping a younger girl balance and said he felt proud, not of what Lucas had overcome, but of what he had created for others. Asked what the biggest lesson had been, he looked into the camera and said that true leaders aren't those who guide others down the path they believe is right, but those who have the courage to follow when someone shows them a better way. A year later, Freedom Steps expanded to 3 new cities. Diana received the Pediatric Rehabilitation Innovation Award, and her methodology began spreading to hospitals nationwide. Lucas, now using only a light cane on difficult days, enrolled in regular school and became a youth spokesperson for the program, inspiring other children to find their own pace. Richard learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of all, that true power does not lie in controlling every move, but in knowing when it is time to step back and let others lead. In a world where powerful people rarely change their perspectives, and those without power often remain in the shadows, the story of Richard, Diana, and Lucas reminds us that true transformation occurs when we cross the invisible boundaries that separate us. When a billionaire learns from a waitress, when a father follows in his son's footsteps. If this story about how a simple gesture of dignity changed lives forever touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to our channel, because we believe the most profound revolutions don't start with grand manifestos or billion-dollar fortunes. They start when someone has the courage to take an authentic first step and someone else has the wisdom to